Captain America is certainly one of the most popular Marvel characters of all time, and his absolute classic run of films and appearances in the MCU have done nothing but aid in his popularity over the past few decades. And I think the complexity of the character's arc during his time in the MCU is a large reason for his popularity and is fascinating to look at in an attempt to dissect it. So in this video, I'll be analyzing the psychology of Captain America from film to film to track his mindset throughout the Infinity Saga. When we're introduced to Steve in the first Avenger, he's a rather small, short, and scrawny man, but he certainly has heart, as he's not afraid to speak or stand up for others, even given his lackluster physical stature, and he even has a strong desire to serve his country in the war. He tells his best friend Bucky that, "There are men laying down their lives. I got no right to do any less than them. That's what you don't understand. This isn't about me." The scene I just paraphrased certainly sums up Steve's mindset at this point of his life. He knows that what the German forces are trying to do is wrong, and he wants to help his country stand up against it. And during his 5th attempt to enlist in the army, Steve is confronted by Dr. Abraham, who asks him if he wants to kill Nazis. To which Steve replies, "I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from." And little did Steve know it at the time, but this answer would change his life forever, as Dr. Abraham was ironing out a serum that could give individuals superhuman capabilities. But he wasn't content giving this level of power and responsibility to just anyone. He wanted it to be someone who had the heart and moral code to use their abilities for good. And if there was any question to whether or not Steve was the right man for the job, well, he silenced those doubts when he jumped on what he thought to be a live grenade while training with his fellow soldiers. And at the end of the film, Captain America makes the ultimate sacrifice play, as he crashes himself and a plane full of explosives into an iceberg. And just when Steve thought he had everything he ever wanted, the physical ability to act upon his strong moral compass, and the girl of his dreams, he loses it all. And after waking up from his comatose state, he just simply says, "I had a date." And this has always been an absolutely brutal line, but it does ultimately reinforce his stance from earlier in the film, as him enlisting in the army was truly not about his own self-interest, and he was certainly willing to lay down his life just the same as every other soldier. When we next see Cap in the Avengers, well, he's a man out of place, in a time that he isn't used to, and is struggling to adapt to. Rather than fighting Nazis, he's now combating aliens and gods. And while Hydra did have some advanced technology, this is certainly a giant step up. And Steve initially clashes with the other Avengers, as his personality isn't super compatible with the likes of the wise-talking Tony Stark, or the espionage of Natasha and Clint. But the death of Agent Coulson in this film, in a lot of ways mirrors the death of Bucky in the first Avenger, and is largely what hardens Cap's resolve to decide to make things work with this ragtag team of misfits. Because if there's a man laying down his life for the cause, well, Cap has no right to do anything less. And speaking of laying down your life, seeing Tony make what looked like a sacrifice play to take out the Chitauri army changes Steve's view of Iron Man, as he grows a respect and liking towards him that will be very important as the saga continues. Because while Tony may have an arrogant and witty shell, at the end of the day, he cares about the betterment of society, just the same as Captain America, though they may have differing views on what that betterment looks like at times. At the start of The Winter Soldier, we see Captain America interacting with Sam Wilson, and the two bond over their attempts to reacclimate to not serving overseas in a war. You see, Cap is not only adjusting to being in a new time, but to a new non-war style of life. Or is he? Because it seems like he's simply traded in taking orders from Colonel Phillips for taking orders from Nick Fury. And while the technology and time he's in has certainly changed, he's still functioning as a good soldier at this point in time. But when he realizes that Natasha has orders that he's not aware of, well, he starts to question who he's serving. You see, Steve cares about the ideals that America was founded on and fought wars to protect. So he doesn't take kindly to deception and blurred lines, and in doing some soul-searching later in the film, speaking to a now elderly Peggy Carter, Steve says, "For as long as I can remember, I just wanted to do what was right. I guess I'm not quite sure what that is anymore. And I thought I could throw myself back in and follow orders, serve. It's just not the same. And this brings us to the inner conflict that Cap will have not only in this film, but for the rest of the series really. What is the right thing to do? You see, the lines were very clear when it was the US versus Germany, but now it's a new age of espionage, and he's struggling to adapt to the terrain, to read if he's on the right side or not. And the elevator scene is actually a great visualization of his adaptation, as the elevator fills up with more and more of Cap's supposed allies, which forces him to read the fact that they're all being sent in to neutralize him, and are indeed not allies anymore. Making Captain America into a fugitive, and the return of his best friend Bucky as the Winter Soldier, forces Steve to operate in a conflict that is anything but black and white. And you'd think these blurred lines might confuse his seemingly incorruptible moral code, but this is Captain America we're talking about after all. So when he realizes that S.H.I.E.L.D., the organization that he thought he was serving his country by working for, has been corrupted by the very forces he fought during World War II, well, he decides to uproot the organization entirely, because he knows that Hydra cannot be allowed to exist any longer. Now, as for his former best friend Bucky had essentially been crafted into the evil version of Captain America, similar superhuman strength, but with added mind control to take his free will away. Or is it that clear-cut? Because through Captain America's evolution, he grows to understand that things aren't always going to be as simple as the US versus Nazis, and decides to believe that his friend, the Bucky he knew, is still somewhere in the Winter Soldier's psyche, and in the end, he was right, as Bucky saves Cap from drowning, with something seemingly awakened in his mind. In Avengers Age of Ultron, we see Steve and Tony's disagreement on how to better society start to grow, as they both fundamentally disagree on Tony's meddling into AI. You see, it's clear that they both want to protect society and its people, but while Tony sees a suit of armor around the world that could keep it safe, Steve thinks that the safest hands are their own, and isn't trusting of using AI to protect the world. About halfway through the film, Cap tells Tony, every time someone tries to win a war before it starts, innocent people die. Every time. And this really symbolizes why Cap is a leader of the team, despite Tony making most of their weapons and clearly being the brains behind the operation, because Steve's moral code and mindset is needed to keep the team on track and avoid snafus such as Ultron. But what happens when his moral compass becomes conflicted? Civil War brings us to the breaking point of the Avengers, and it all really comes down to Captain America's decision to not tell Tony that the Winter Soldier killed his parents. In Steve's own words, he thought he was sparing Tony by not telling him the truth, but ultimately, he was sparing himself. And this really marks the one and only time that Cap objectively makes a morally wrong decision in the whole series. As a side note, holding on to this lie is actually why I think Cap fails to lift Thor's hammer in Age of Ultron. But you see, if Steve had just told Tony about this news as soon as he found out, then Tony would have had time to process it, and yes, he still would have been pissed in the moment, but given time to process it, I think he would have been able to understand that Bucky had no control over what he did. And while I still don't think Tony would forgive Bucky, I do think he would have been able to keep his emotions in check enough to not attack Bucky in that war bunker, if things even progressed that far in this alternate timeline. And this ultimately would lead to the two pillars of the MCU not drifting apart. Now, the disagreement over the Sokovia Accord still would have taken its toll, and the group of the Avengers would certainly not be on great terms, but the disagreement between Tony and Steve over the Accords harkens back to Captain America's moral code. He will always trust his own hands and his own decision-making over any organizations. He's seen S.H.I.E.L.D. get corrupted from the inside out, so he makes the decision to trust that he himself won't become corrupted. And is this arrogant, as Rhodey points out? Yeah, it certainly is. But again, this is Captain America we're talking about here. And while both sides of the debate have merit to them, it can be seen that Captain America will not become corrupted no matter the circumstances, as he has quite literally only made one morally questionable decision his entire time as a hero, and even this questionable decision was initially done to spare Tony from opening an old wound. By the time of Infinity War, We see that Captain America has been dealing with the ramifications of not signing the Sokovia Accords, as he has been on the run for a few years, and he's even ripped the star off of his uniform. This, in conjunction with Cap dropping his shield at the end of Civil War, metaphorically signals a temporary end to Steve's time as Captain America, as he's lost faith in the world's governing bodies, so he won't bear the stars and stripes anymore. But when it comes time to defend mankind, well, he steps right up to the fight yet again. Because if there's men laying down their lives, Steve has no right to do anything less. At his core, he's still the same person he was in the first Avenger. Endgame sees Steve dealing with the blip, and his first time ever really losing a battle or war during his time as a soldier, and I think getting to see Tony have a family and settle down during the 5-year jump, in conjunction with seeing Peggy during his time-traveling expedition, makes Steve for the first time yearn to be done with the fight. And Endgame is truly Steve's last battle as Captain America. And despite having his eyes set on a time travel-fueled retirement and reunion with Peggy, Cap shows yet again that he's willing to put it all on the line and fight until the end, as he stood against Thanos and his entire army at one point. And regardless of if the rest of the Avengers pulled up or not, I think we all know that Captain America was going to fight on regardless, even if he knew he was destined to lose brutally. And the slow dance with Peggy at the end of this film signals Steve's retirement from the soldier life. He quite literally helped save the world numerous times, and now he's ready to enjoy what life really has to offer with the one woman who he always loved. All in all, Captain America is a rather consistent yet complex character throughout his 7 entries in the MCU. He was a man who always had the greater good in mind and was willing to sacrifice for a greater purpose. And even when lines became blurred or the odds were stacked against him, Steve's moral code remained incorruptible for his entire time serving as Captain America. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this analysis of Captain America, please feel free to check out some of my other The Psychology of style videos, or other MCU content, which will be linked in the description. And if you agree, disagree, or just have strong Captain America related thoughts, as always, I love to hear them in the comments.